Human beings have used sound to communicate for thousands and thousands of years. And in fact, there are some that believe that what we think of as a song might have actually been the earliest form of speech. And we do know that for a long time, music and song was passed down by an oral tradition from generation to generation. But in this class, we're going to begin our study at the time when Europeans began to write music down on paper, the concept of music notation. This defines the development of Western music, and it has allowed for variety, for diffusion, and for music staying power. The European musical tradition has been very influential throughout the world, and again because of musical notation. This influence of European musical style surpasses language or religion. Now, it was first invented to further the goals of Christian worship. Because of musical notation, music can be thought of as a product or a commodity, something that can be preserved or taught and learned, bought and sold. But music's also a social activity, both recreational and spiritual. It enables people to feel connected to a larger group, and it affords opportunities for people to express their feelings. There's essentially two fundamental types of music. One being sacred. Sacred music is religious music. It's essential to worship. It's designed to inspire the faithful. And we're going to look at how these traditions shifted to meet the needs of a changing society. The other basic type of music is secular, non-religious music. This is social music making for the purpose of entertainment and personal expression. This is the context in which music really becomes a social activity and a commodity item. The ancient Mediterranean culture is the foundation of the Western musical heritage. And it kind of begins with the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476. This marked the beginning of the Middle Ages, which is basically, it's the Middle Ages. It's between the classical period of ancient Greece and Rome and the Renaissance. And it's a 1,000-year period, but we're going to break it down. We're going to think of it in two halves. We begin with the early Middle Ages from about 500 to about the year 1000, and this was a period of political and cultural consolidation. The power essentially stemmed from kings with the approval of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, the struggle between these two powers is the core of European history. One figure that we're going to look at just for a moment is Charlemagne. And who is known for the Carolingian Renaissance. But he was a progressive monarch, and he's created or credited, with the modern concept of a strong central government. He encouraged education and he promoted social justice. It was during his reign that Europeans began the systematic use of music notation. Now, the later Middle Ages, between the years 1000 and roughly 1450, you had universities being founded throughout Europe. Cities began to emerge as cultural centers. Literary landmarks helped to shape the languages of the respective countries. The Song of Roland, which was written around 1100 from France. Dante's Divine Comedy from 1307 helped shape the Italian language. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales from 1386 came from England. It was also during this time that the great cathedrals were constructed. Most noteworthy is the Notre Dame in Paris. And this cathedral also became a musical center. It was here that polyphony, or multi-voiced music, another way to think of polyphony is music with more than one melody happening at the same time. It was here that polyphony was first notated and integrated into worship. The first type of polyphony was something called organum, and it was developed here. Now, organum is basically plain chant, which is a single line melody that was used by the church. We'll talk more about that in a later chapter. It was decorated by adding one or more musical lines, and these lines could either be sung or they could be added as a drone on an instrument, say like a hurdy-gurdy. This period also saw the first named composers of the Western tradition, both of them from Notre Dame. You had Léonin and Periton. In the late Middle Ages, trade routes formed throughout Europe. This is largely due because a merchant class arose outside of feudal society, and this merchant class drew its wealth from trade and commerce. But not only merchants moved along the trade routes, but musicians did as well. And music at this time became a necessity for worship. Music became very desirable as a form of recreation, and music therefore became a crucial commodity in the European economy. This was the period that we saw a flowering of music in vernacular, the language of the people, as opposed to Latin, the language of the church. And this was brought on largely because this time period was an era of violence that was instigated by a deep religious beliefs, and this led to the Crusades. During this time, the status of women was raised by a universal cult of Mary, the mother of Jesus. And also the concept of chivalry appeared among the knights. The songs of the court minstrels basically had the theme of adoring women with a passion. And the perfect symbol of this was the knight who worshipped his lady from afar, and she inspired him to perform deeds of daring and self-sacrifice. These songs were sung by the troubadours and the trouvères, which were French poet-musicians. And these musicians gave us the first extended notated tradition of love song. And they also introduced more complex instruments into the West. In fact, many of the instruments and song styles that they used were adapted from the Middle East, and we'll talk more about those at a later time. The early Renaissance, beginning in about 1450 up until around 1520, marked the inventions like the compass that led to voyages of discovery as Europeans were looking for new trade routes to India and China. The inventor Johannes Gutenberg introduced printing to Europe. And that's important because after Constantinople fell, or the Eastern Roman Empire, after Constantinople fell in 1453, these ancient Greek and Roman writings that had been lost to Europe were rediscovered through the Crusades, and they were printed and distributed throughout Europe. And this led to an increased interest in human or secular concerns. Now, these secular ideals influenced architecture, art, and sculpture. The Gothic cathedrals and castles gave way to lavish Renaissance palaces that were built according to the classical style that really strove for order and balance. The movement began in Italy, well, because Rome was in Italy, so that was the nation that was closest to the ancient Roman culture. And it's not coincidental then that the greatest names in painting and sculpture are Italian, names like Botticelli, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo. At this time, the nude human form was no longer something that had to be covered up or banned outright. It was now revered as a thing of beauty. Painters began to explore the beauty of nature, and they did so by conforming to laws of perspective and composition. Musicians in medieval and Renaissance society were primarily supported by the chief institutions of society, like the church, city and state, or royal and aristocratic courts. And they were employed in a variety of jobs like choir masters and singers, organists, instrumentalists, copyists, composers, teachers, instrument builders, and then in the 16th century, music printers. There was also a growth in the number of supporting musical institutions like church choirs and schools, or music publishing houses, or even civic wind bands. We saw an increased opportunities for apprentices who could study with master singers or master players or instrument builders. There were a few professional women during the Renaissance period, primarily court singers. We also saw, as we mentioned before, the rise of the merchant class, and that brought with it a new group of music patrons. And this was paralleled by the emergence of amateur musicians from the cultivated middle and upper classes. And these amateur musicians sang secular songs, and they played simple dances on instruments. Because of the printing press, printed music books were now available and very affordable, which led to a dramatic spread of music literacy throughout Europe. Early music performances really open to speculation. There was no absolute correct way to perform a work, which gives a lot of leeway to modern performers. There were a few basic principles that applied, though. Sacred genres were generally vocal ensembles, and they were usually small groups of males only. Typically, the lower ranged music would have been sung by the men, and if there were any higher range music that required a higher voice, that would have been sung by small boys. Women were prohibited from singing in church unless it happened to be a church or like a nunnery where only women were present. Secular music didn't really have any restrictions at all. The performances could have varied a great deal. A piece would have been written just in multiple parts, and you performed it with whatever you had at hand. It was completely appropriate to sing it or to perform a piece with all voices, or any combination of voices and instruments. If you were lacking one of the voices, but you had someone who played, say, a lute, then the lute could take the place of that vocal part. Maybe you had a shawm, or a rebec, or a sackbut. Some of these instruments, they could take the place of the voices, or maybe you had total instrumental performances. So any combination of voice and instrument would have been fair game. Expressive markings like tempo and dynamics were completely absent in early music. About the only thing that we're pretty confident about is sacred music. The general tempo would have been about 60 to 72 beats a minute, because that would have been the resting heart rate of an adult male. Beyond that, pretty much anything goes.